Is a action-oriented foreign policy think tank based in Washington, D.C. that advocates a grand strategy of restraint and aims to move U.S. foreign policy away from endless war and toward vigorous diplomacy, economic engagement, and the combating of existential threats such as climate change. Our vision is a world where peace is the norm and war the exception. I'm Sarang Shidore, Director of Studies at the Quincy Institute, welcoming you to this webinar. And this webinar is based on a brief written by our Senior Research Fellow, who's also a participant today, Jessica Lee, and myself. And the brief is titled, "The Folly of Pushing South Korea Toward a China-Containment strategy." So it's right here, and you can download it on our website. As we know, in May, the South Korean people elected a new president, Yoon who has promised to be tougher on Beijing, among other things. President Biden has had a busy Asia month in May with a visit to South Korea, where he met President Yoon, but also he visited Japan, where he held a summit with his fellow Quad leaders from Australia, India, and Japan. And the visit was also preceded here in Washington with a summit between President Biden and most of the leaders of ASEAN states in Southeast Asia. Based on his campaign rhetoric, Washington expects President Yoon to be tougher on China and more sympathetic to the U.S. position on China, which is focused on countering it and potentially containing it. However, President Yoon will face major constraints in moving toward a more confrontational policy with China, should that be his choice. And our brief, Jessica and I explain why pushing South Korea toward that direction may be a mistake for the United States, for U.S. national interests. So we're going to discuss the brief, but actually go well beyond with three excellent panelists that we have on our webinar today. I'm going to start with the first, Professor Jun-Young Kim. Welcome, Professor Kim.
Hi, thank you very much for inviting me to this important. And actually, I have read your article. It was very interesting, and then actually most of parts that I agree with it. Okay.
Thank you, thank you, Professor Kim. We are so delighted to have you here. You bring a lot of wealth of experience to this panel. You're a professor of International Studies Department at Handong Global University in South Korea. Previously, you were Chancellor of Korea National Diplomatic Academy from 2019 to 2021. Your areas of specialization are theories of international relations, U.S.-China relations, U.S. South Korea relations, and inter-Korean relations. That's quite a bit there. Professor Kim, you've also previously served in advisory committees of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Defense, and the Ministry of Unification, and also in the National Security Council. Our second guest today is Dr. Andrew Yeo. Welcome, Andrew.
Hi, good morning. Pleasure to be here with everyone here. Yeah, and especially with my colleague, Professor Kim, as well, too. And Professor Kim, the last time I think I saw you was exactly 3 years ago at a CSIS Strategic Forum when you were in Washington, D.C. pre-pandemic. So good to be connected with you again, but now virtually.
Yeah, we are delighted to have both of you. And Andrew Yeo, you are a senior fellow and South Korea Foundation chair in Korea Studies at the Brookings Institution's Center for East Asia Policy Studies. You're also a professor of politics at Catholic University. Your latest book is State, Society, and Markets in North Korea, and it's out now with Cambridge University Press. Your scholarly publications can be found in many journals, including International Studies Quarterly, European Journal of International Relations, Perspectives in Politics, Journal of East Asian Studies, and so forth, among them. So we are very glad to have you here today. Our third panelist is my colleague and co-author on this brief, Jessica Lee. Welcome, Jessica.
Thank you, Sarang.
You, of course, are a senior research fellow in the East Asia program right here at the Quincy Institute. Your research interests include U.S. foreign policy toward the Indo-Pacific region, with an emphasis on the Korean Peninsula. You began your career in Washington 15 years ago on Capitol Hill, where you served as a professional staff member handling the Asia region for the chairman of the House Committee on Foreign Affairs. And subsequently, you served as a senior legislative assistant on international security and trade for a member of Congress in the Ways and Means Committee. So great to have you here to discuss our co-authored brief and also other things. I'm going to start and get right into it now, and I'm going to start with you, Jessica. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the election. A few weeks back, we had an election in South Korea where President Yoon was elected by a thin majority. And he also has a complicated governing situation in front of him when he deals with many issues, but especially foreign policy, which is the focus of our webinar today. So tell us about this divided mandate that he has, and what sorts of challenges is he facing internally when he governs, given his thin majority and given other aspects of government that he's dealing with.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Sarang, for bringing us together. And it was such an honor to work with you on the Quincy brief. Thank you for your excellent contributions. I learned a lot from that process. To just start off with what you laid out in terms of the March 9th presidential election and sort of, its implication going forward under the new Yoon administration. I think, as you noted, it was such a close election. And as somebody who watched it from Washington, it was fascinating to see not just numerically speaking how close the election was, but all the snazzy graphics and interfaces that South Koreans use to deliver and make politics interesting and perhaps more relevant to ordinary South Koreans. So it was fascinating on many regards. As you noted, President Yoon won by only 0.73% point margin, which is the closest in South Korea's history. And the opposition Democratic Party, holds a supermajority in the National Assembly, which means they can pass all bills except constitutional amendments. The next legislative election is in April 2024. So there is going to be a substantial period of essentially a divided government. Something that we know very well in Washington as well, given our election cycles. The soaring housing prices was really, I think, a critical, if not the issue that really defined South Korean voter turnout and their voting preferences. And unfortunately became an indictment against the previous liberal government led by Jae-in. I read a story back in February of housing prices in the suburb of Ilsan tripling since President Moon took office in 2017, and how an average apartment costs in that area $562,000, which make it difficult, if not impossible, especially for young people to buy a home. I think candidate Yoon's pledge to cut capital gains taxes, as well as deregulate rules on knockdown and rebuild homes, were likely critical swing issues for many voters. So even if foreign policy wasn't really a top issue for South Korean voters in that presidential election, it does seem that President Yoon's decisions going forward on matters related to foreign policy, especially related to China and North Korea, will have a major, profound impact on South Korean economy and security. It's also important, of course, to understand that the division of power within the South Korean government is real. and that the opposing parties now control the executive and the legislative branches. And while the executive, traditionally plays a major role, if not the role, in shaping and crafting foreign policy, it's also the case that the legislative branch, much like here in Washington, wields considerable powers as the body that is more in tune with local concerns. Much like the House of Representatives in Washington is sometimes called the People's House, the 300 seats South Korean National Assembly is where, I think the public can voice their concerns more directly with their elected representatives. And much like the U.S. Congress, the National Assembly has the power to investigate government officials, subpoena government officials, delay implementation of foreign policy, or reveal information to shape public attitudes on matters, et cetera, et cetera. And perhaps most critically, the National Assembly can use its budget setting authority over the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to demand clarification on foreign policy or oppose issues like troop deployments, which are obviously matters that we debate in the US Congress as well. So what does this all mean? I think it means that President Yoon in general will have to listen to the public and build unity where he can, rather than try to bulldoze his way toward reform and radical changes that could, really invite backlash and division. Last Wednesday, of course, South Korea held local elections in which President Yoon's party, People Power Party, won. And former Democratic Party candidate Lee Jae-in won a seat in the National Assembly as well. So just to wrap up, I would say that, it seems that the Yoon government may, on one hand, interpret the local election results as sort of giving itself more of a mandate to govern more aggressively compared to in March, where it won by such a thin margin. And that could be by forging closer ties with Washington and Tokyo, or banding together in some sort of a US-led strategy to constrain and contain China. The Biden administration, it's important to note, have said that they don't want American allies to have to choose between US and China. But phrases such as, respect for rules-based international order are usually interpreted by Asia watchers in Washington to be in direct reference to China. And there are other indications that we cited in the brief that we think Washington does expect President Yoon to uncritically accept US preferences when it comes to China. So I think this is a very important space to watch and something that's quite dynamic. And I look forward to other comments on this. Thanks.
Thank you, Jessica. Andrew Yo, Jessica just pointed to a number of domestic factors that are going to be in play. This is a robust democracy we are talking about. It's multi-party, two main parties, but there are others. And there are other institutions. So you wrote, in fact, you have written quite a bit on this topic. You've written a book on how civil society plays into anti-based protests, for example, anti-US based protests. You also written a paper on the nature of democracy in South Korea. Speak to Jessica Lee, some of her points, and also try to, if you could, tell us how democracy and civil society plays into the question of setting foreign policy in South Korea.
Sure, thanks, Sarang. And first, just let me congratulate you and Jessica for completing the report. Whether one agrees or disagrees with the recommendations offered in there, it's definitely worth reading, especially to those who affectionately are referred to as the blob, because I think it really does. I think it's important that we don't make this reflexively or run on inertia or what. I do think that there's a bit of an echo chamber, and it's important to hear and give attention to the report that you guys have written about U.S. South Korea and China. Hopefully we have some time to talk a little bit more about what's in the report as well too. But to your question, and just bouncing off of what Jessica had argued about democracy and civil society and how they play into South Korean foreign policy. Yeah, so domestic politics, of course, is important and how it shapes Korean foreign policy. With democratization, it has really opened up the space for conversation and discussing policies towards North Korea and China. So just generally speaking, South Korea has had a strong legacy of anti-communism. I think that's still embedded in domestic institutional structures, such as the national security laws. But new voices, including those from civil society, have gradually shaped foreign policy discourse in South Korea. So we are hearing different voices on issues But I think one unfortunate effect or a side effect is sustainable polarization of the eggs. So that in itself can bring new challenges, I think, when we think about the role of domestic politics and foreign policy. But in terms of the issue of divided government, I think that's absolutely something that we here in Washington we have to be mindful of. There is an assumption that because the Yoon government wants to take on a harder position towards China, that everything will align very easily. But we do have to keep it in mind that there is a significant part of government, and especially when you think about national control of the budget, that if you want to spend more on defense or reorient your force posture in a certain way, it's still going to have to get clearance from the National Assembly. That being said, as Jessica already pointed out, the conservative governments of the Yoon government may feel though that it has a little more of a mandate, or at least better footing, domestic footing, in policies on both domestic and foreign issues.
Andrew, I hate to interrupt you, but I'm having trouble hearing you in some moments there. So I'm not sure whether we can, because I don't want the audience to lose your insights. So I'm not sure whether you can adjust your audio a little bit while we can get back to you and have you finish that question in just a second, unless you want to give it another shot. Did you adjust something at your end?
Yes, let me just.
We'll get back to you.
Okay, no, yes.
I'm going to get back to Andrew Yo just in a second, but I want to turn to Professor Kim now. Professor Kim, what are your expectations of President Yoon's foreign policy going forward? He said things in the campaign, now he's president. We all know that there are campaigns and there is governing. So look at your crystal ball and tell us what you see down the road.
Thank you very much, Sarang. Actually, I have to come forward because I heard that my mic is not very clear. Is okay now? Sorry for my huge face. You have to see me. But anyways, okay. Jessica said it's so fascinating, but always, as a political scientist, Korean Peninsula is always fascinating. But as a Korean, it's not really, I cannot, detach my feelings and my emotion. And especially, actually I was so frustrated by the result, not just because I supported and I advised Lee Jae-myung and I lost, but in a way, the foreign policy area, actually, I worry the most because, many people criticized Moon's policy, especially peace processes pro-North is a frame, I believe. And they say, because, it's time to choose one side over another, but I don't agree with it. And if you decide one side over another, then, most of the problem solved. I don't think so. Choosing one side over another cause another problem. That's the beginning of the problem. I think one of the thesis that your article said is, I think this contains that part too. As a politician, as a, considering domestic politics here, so maybe clear attitude, hardline policy toward North gives you a boost, but that causes another problem. So and for example, Moon government is as a frame as a pro-North. So maybe whenever Moon tried to have a dialogue or negotiation with North, and always framed as a pro-North in domestic politics in South Korea. But I do believe that if Yoon tried to pro-US and especially to pro-Japanese, pro-Japan policy, that will be the trap for them, just like pro-North policy was framed in Moon during the Moon government. So I don't think the things that they decide aside wouldn't make problems solved. And another issue is because it's a single term 5 years in domestic politics. South Korean president has only 5 years and the single term. And based on the experience we have, like in the past 20, 30 years, 2 years, especially beginning 2 years, is most critical time. Remaining 3 years sometimes is just lame duck. Even though Moon Jae-in was popular, but he couldn't do much things in Korean politics. Today's the news is actually they're start to talk about the next president candidate. Can you believe that? Yeah, that's a single term. This is the big weakness. So, this party, this Minjudang and the Democratic Party and People's Party, this is it's going to be a problem, especially 2 years. And this is very similar to American politics, I think. It's, exactly divided into two. Trump did it. Sometimes it's a reflection of the politics and this United States of America, DSA, just like that. We divided twice actually, North and the South divided into two. And you can witness in the local election just finished 2 days ago. So it's not gonna be easy. And the one last point that I want to make is Yoon is really novice in foreign policy, and the people that I know very well and around him, from the foreign minister to unification minister to national security advisor, there are actually people who actually work for Lee Myung-bak. So many people say this is a revival of the Lee Myung-bak politics, and we can expect from that point is a pro Japan, pro US, and anti-North and things like that. And they say they continue to open the door for North Korea, but they never said how to open the door. And that's the issue. It's not going to be easy. Okay, I'll stop here and I will make another comment later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was quite a bit there. And we are going to get to some of those topics you brought up, like North Korea, in a little bit. But I want to get back now to Andrew Yo and give him a chance to finish his response to my question earlier,
Sure.
Democracy and civil society, and how it plays into South Korean foreign policy going forward.
Sure, thanks. And apologies for the technical issues. Hopefully the older technology of plug-in headphones and microphone works better. So to respond to your earlier question about democracy and civil society, I had argued earlier that yes, these democratization, I think, has really opened up the space for conversation in discussing policies about North Korea and China. For those familiar with South Korean history, it has a strong legacy of anti-communism that's still embedded in domestic institutional structures, such as the national security laws. But there are new voices, including those from civil society, that have gradually shaped foreign policy discourse in South Korea. So even having discussions about North Korea or engaging North Korea or cooperating with China would have been unheard of 20 or 30 years ago. So we have seen changes in foreign policy ideas in South Korea, but unfortunately, one of the side effects has been an increasing polarization of views. So on one hand, democratization is a good thing. You have more ideas in the policy space, but over time, you've seen greater division or polarization in terms of how we approach North Korea or how we approach China. And I think Professor Kim was alluding to some of those points. But in terms of civil society specifically, how does it impact foreign policy? I mean, I'll just bring up three issues, which are probably the most important ones. Actually, North Korea would be the most important one, but I was going to speak about the alliance, South Korea-Japan relations, and also the role of and also foreign policy with China, which your report was directly addressing. But in terms of the direction of moving towards a more stronger, or I guess a more pro-US leaning relationship between South Korea and the United States, I don't think it's going to lead anytime soon to any strong reactions from civil society. But one area that we may want to look for is if South Korea decides to take on a much stronger military posture, if there's, I mean, I haven't seen the Yoon administration was actually, I think their military defense budget was lower than what it may have been before. But if we see any major shifts in military posture, or if we see, South Korea granting more rights for the U.S. military on things like the THAAD missile defense system, you could see some backlash, certainly at the local level. But then if there was any kind of incident that would trigger issues about sovereignty, some may begin questioning, why isn't South Korea asserting more of its own autonomy? We could see this becoming more of a domestic issue. Same thing with Korea-Japan relations. I do think that there is more, there's still definitely the relationship is in a difficult place, but Japan is, I think South Koreans are willing to try to improve that relationship with Japan. Certainly the elites, the Yoon government wants to. And I think the domestic polity can follow as well too, but there's also the danger in pushing too far ahead. And certainly if it looks like the Yoon government is trying to improve relations with Japan, but ignore some of the historical tensions that have existed, most specifically the court ruling on wartime forced labor. If it looks like that's being swept over the rug, I think we'll also see some pushback as well too. So those are things that I think South Korea not only needs to be careful about, but the United States will also have to keep that into mind as they encourage or push or pressure, use your term of choice, whether they do these things, where they try to push South Korea to, improve trilateral relations with Japan and Korea, or try to contain China. So some things to consider.
Great. Turning to you, Jessica, now, and bringing this conversation back to Washington, D.C. from Seoul. We're going to go back to Seoul, but for a moment, we'll stay here in Washington and try to understand, and we wrote about this in our brief together, about U.S. expectations of South Korea. Andrew Yo just mentioned that at the end of his response. What are those expectations here in Washington? And what sorts of expectations will perhaps could change now that President Biden has a candidate that he possibly might have favored in the Blue House, or rather he's moved out of the Blue House, but as president of South Korea?
Yes, thank you, Sarang. Well, I think I want to first start off by foot-stopping what Andrew said just now about Japan and not pushing South Korea too hard towards some sort of a rapprochement, given the state of South Korean public on matters particularly related to the sexual enslavement of South Korean women during the war. So I agree with him completely on that. I think, in going to what you said, Sarang, about, Washington's perspective and all of this, where it's coming from. This is obviously a very difficult issue to analyze, in part because it's happening sort of right now as we speak. But, as you noted, we do try to parse out in the brief the best we can in terms of what we think Washington's likely request will be, whether it's implicit or explicit when it comes to the Yoon government. As I said earlier, how the Yoon administration governs in the area of foreign policy will be extremely important for the United States. And of course, it comes at this backdrop of an intensifying U.S.-China rivalry, something you've written about, Sarang, a lot, compounded by the Ukraine crisis. During the presidential campaign, the candidate Yoon, you'll recall, called for a much tougher policy on China and closer relations with the United States and Japan, positions that President Yoon confirmed upon getting elected. And such views, of course, align, as everyone has said, broadly speaking, with Washington's preferences when it comes to the Indo-Pacific strategy laid out in February. This strategy really emphasizes cooperation between the United States and its allies in Asia against what it described as mounting challenges from the People's Republic of China, a country that seeks to dominate not just the region, but potentially the world as well. So in this context, it seems that Washington, again, will likely ask South Korea to play a greater security role in its as part of US's Indo-Pacific strategy. But, as we warn in the paper, this could be a very costly move, not just from South Korean economy perspective, but in terms of the long-term interests of the United States. And, what we mean by that, of course, is in general, more of an enhanced American influence and economic opportunities and connections with South Korea. In other words, pushing South Korea too hard, too fast toward some sort of a China containment strategy could actually backfire and hurt the alliance, as paradoxical as it might sound. Overconfidence could result in serious misreadings in terms of the level of support that exists within not just the South Korean public, which Andrew touched on just now, but the elite as well, the opinion makers, former policymakers, and people who drive and influence public opinions on these issues. In terms of issues like joining some sort of a bloc-like structure that excludes China. Other controversial requests from Washington could include perhaps opposing more explicitly China's military intimidation of Taiwan, associating more thoroughly with the Quad, deepening security cooperation with Japan, and additional deployment of Lockheed Martin-made THAAD batteries. Of course, Beijing perceives all of these as threats or security concerns. And other U.S. preferences, are a little bit more generic and focus on North Korea, which is something we're going to talk about soon, such as delaying transfer of wartime operation control to South Korean military, and enforcement of all UN Security Council sanctions resolutions on North Korea, and of course, buying more American arms. Many of these demands, again, are not expressed forcefully or explicitly in public, so it is very difficult to sort of parse out what exactly Washington is asking of Seoul and perhaps of other allies going forward in Asia. I want to take a minute to just, put this in context. I think I've seen a lot of analysis, good analysis about the rise of anti-China sentiments in South Korea and what this will mean for South Korean foreign policy on China. As we all know, this is something that, of course, grew especially in 2017 when Beijing retaliated in response to the THAAD deployments to the tune of $7.5 billion in economic damage in 2017 in South Korea. This is from Hyundai Research Institute. Anti-China sentiments also grew in recent months due to perceived slight of South Korea at the Beijing Winter Olympics. But at the same time, while there may be growing or high level of distrust toward China, South Koreans also don't think that it should treat China as an enemy or an adversary. In part because China is its largest trading partner. Over a quarter of its total trade is with China. And it's also very dependent on China for critical equipments and components, including imports that relate to rare earth minerals. According to a 2021 survey that we cited in the brief by Seoul National University, nearly 90% of South Koreans said that they don't see China as an enemy. And according to another survey conducted over the past 5 years by Korea Institute of National Unification, more South Koreans support a balanced policy in the context of U.S.-China rivalry compared to leaning too heavily on U.S. or China. South Korean political elite also has similar ambivalence, which we cite in the paper as well. So I guess in conclusion, I think what we're seeing is that South Korea, as a robust democracy with a very active citizenry, trying to push or prejudge an outcome on an issue as consequential as China could cause major problems for the United States. We cited specifically an example in the Philippines, in the post-Marcos era, where its government decided to end U.S. military presence in that country when the democratically elected Filipino legislature ordered the closure of the Subic Bay Naval Base back in 1992. So this is, I think, in general, what we are sort of concerned about in terms of pushing another country's foreign policy without, much regard for the dynamics historically and otherwise that really drive that process.
Indeed, Jessica. In fact, in the briefing, make this point many times that it's one thing to have preferences, Well, first, those preferences should be analyzed for their value to the national interest in the United States. The second step is also to see whether those preferences can actually be sustained with the ally in question. Is it possible not just for the short term, but also for the long term? What sorts of dynamics that can create in the alliance? And I don't think that's been discussed or being discussed adequately in Washington. But I want to turn to Professor Kim now and try and get at one of the points that Jessica brought up, which is the issue of THAAD. This Terminal High Altitude Area Defense Anti-Ballistic Missile System that the US has installed in South Korea and wishes to install more batteries and also integrate that system with its existing other missile defense systems in the region, such as the Patriot system. Tell us a little bit about the THAAD question. Where do you see President Yoon taking this in terms of both the installation as well as the integration going forward? And what sorts of reactions do you expect in South Korea? Last time, as was mentioned earlier, there were protests in those regions where the batteries were going to be installed. And that led to sanctions from China, which was pretty harsh. So we have had this episode in 2017. Going forward, what do you see happening and what sorts of reactions do you expect within South Korea?
Before I begin, how about now? I changed the mic, the other things. Is it better or worse? Is it okay?
I can hear you, yes. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you very much for your question. Actually, about that, I think it's yes. President Yoon during his campaign, he was willing to deploy more THAAD, but I don't think that's the big issue now, hot issue now. Neither U.S. Biden wants to deploy more, nor I think the Yoon government really need to. Actually, urgent part is that the first deployment is not, it still, have a problem because, local demonstration actually blocked the way out and in and out. So maybe the normalized, the first one is the, I think the urgent mission to do. And especially now, that actually during that time is like overloaded. I think it's the function and that's the effectiveness, those things. So even though what I'm thinking is, even though the conservative government, including President Yoon, talked about the additional deployment of that, I don't think it's really, upcoming issue that will bother, U.S. ROK alliance, as well as Korea-China relationship. That's my personal opinion. But still, if we do go ahead to deploy additional THAAD, then what's going to happen? But the China actually, they regret. Actually, and Jessica and you talked about the push China, South Korea too much actually had an adverse effect. That's exactly what China actually evaluate the experience of the a sanction against South Korea because of the THAAD deployment. And actually, Chinese government got mad and sanctioned because not just because deploying THAAD itself, but because South Korean government, Park Geun-hye government continued until the last moment that we're not gonna deploy THAAD. Just actually, our prime minister at the time visited China 10 days before President Park Geun-hye, declared to, finally declared to deploy THAAD. And actually the prime minister denied that, South Korea had planned to deploy THAAD. So that's the key, many Chinese talked about. And, right now China is surrounded and pushed to the corner from, almost all the country except Russia and North Korea. So now Chinese government actually would appreciate if South Korea maintaining balance or neutrality. Neutrality doesn't mean that, we cannot, perfect neutrality between these two superpowers, but you know what I'm saying? It's not really, try to have a balance, not, so they regret that they pushed South Korea too much. Now they regret in a way. So that issue is a little different now than 2017.
Great. I want to turn to Andrew Yo now and ask you, Andrew, about this question of US preferences and what, of course, our brief talks about warns against pushing them too hard. And we know Jessica laid out some of those preferences. First of all, do you think those are indeed the preferences of President Biden's team? And second, what benefits do you see if all of those preferences were accepted by President Yoon? Let's imagine for a moment. Do you see those as that as being beneficial to the United States? Or do you see some downsides?
Okay, let me address the benefits point last, because I do think there are some benefits from Washington to pushing the U.S. pushing South Korea and what some are seeing as a more confrontational direction towards China. But let me just begin first in response to this balanced approach to South Korea navigating between U.S. and China. And I don't think that South Korea really benefited from taking this cautious, balanced approach. South Korean businesses still haven't recovered. Lotte is not going to come back. Hyundai still lost their investments in China, and China hasn't given, they haven't necessarily been that constructive in addressing North Korean threat. So I don't really see what's been gained for South Korea by taking this balanced approach. And it's not because of, I'm not saying this as a criticism towards South Korea's foreign policy or the Moon government's foreign policy, but really China has changed in the last 5 to 7 years. And so it's made it much, I think, difficult for South Korea to continue with that position. And the second point on the idea that South Korea is being pushed, or the Yoon government is being pushed by the US to adopt a harder stance on China, I think that premise is not quite correct. I think that would have been a more accurate assessment under the Moon government, because Biden and Moon had different approaches or different views, or at least their administrations did, on how to handle China. But in this case, it's really the Yoon government that's quite hawkish. And so for President Yoon himself, I believe, is much more of a hawk on China. I think it's actually the advisors that have advised him to show a little bit more restraint. So you can't really say that it's Washington that's pressuring South Korea at this point to take on more of a hawkish position. Now, that doesn't mean that the US won't continue to encourage the Yoon government to move in that direction. I think they're more in line with their views on China. But to say that it's Washington now that's doing the pressuring, I think that's inaccurate. I think on other issues, perhaps the Japan issue, you might see the US going a little bit more forward. But again, I think it's a different government. So I believe that I just don't think it's phrased quite in the right way. So then now getting to your point about question about not expectations, but the benefits, what does the US gain by involving the South Korean alliance in more of a strategy to contain China? I think for the US, it's really about signaling. It's signaling greater solidarity on the Indo-Pacific strategy. And it should at least increase the cost for China in taking coercive actions on US allies and partners, whether militarily or economically. So so they see it as demonstrating to China or to Russia or to other regional actors that there is this growing coalition in response to Chinese actions in places like the South China Sea, or signing an agreement with Russia on February 4th. It's just to give an analogy, we see, we're not talking about Ukraine or Russia right now, but it was really, we can debate, what led to the conflict in Ukraine, but certainly I think Russia's actions in the Ukrainian invasion united NATO in ways that even the United States couldn't have imagined, and to have Finland and Sweden now knocking or asking to become a member of NATO, that was probably not really in the works or in anyone's mindset 2 years ago. And so in the same way, I think it's China's confrontational position that may push US allies together. And that's where we see South Korea. And to take a theory from one of your own non-resident fellows, Stephen Walt, he talks about the balance of threats. And so if more South Koreans are seeing China as a threat, it's somewhat natural for them to lean towards the United States. Now, that doesn't mean that that there aren't costs or there aren't risks to having more allies coalescing and taking on what looks like to China a containment approach to their interests. And yes, so one area where I think the U.S. May need to exercise caution is if Beijing feels entrapped or if it feels encircled. And so this is where I think it's important to at least continue to find ways of bringing cooperation with Beijing on issues. And I think the United States has. They tend to always throw out climate change as one area of cooperation. But it's really difficult because it takes two to tango, and I'm not really sure what it'll take to try to get Beijing and Washington to reset relations. Certainly, I don't think it was the United States I think the Biden administration would have preferred more engagement with China, but we're not getting to that point. And so that's where I think we have to put our heads together and think about ways of how we can persuade China that this confrontational approach isn't really, at the end of the day, isn't really the interests of either countries, and it's not in the interests of global governance and order.
Great. Some great points there. One thing of note, two things of note that came to my mind. One was certainly the sanctions on South Korea by China were most unhelpful. They have left from all that we know here in Washington, and I think our South Korean friends would agree, that they have left a bad taste in South Korea's mouth. They have not been welcomed. They have not been productive or useful. But we have also seen a similar sort of incident with Japan, which gets much less coverage here in Washington. Sanctions regime of sorts that was long, that stayed for a while. And the issues with Japan, of course, are very, very severe historically, in a way that they're simply not there with China. So this gets me to a question from the audience, and please drop in your questions. Some of you already have, but you're welcome to add one or a few more in the Q&A box. And this question comes from Joseph Bosco, and he wants to know about how the Seoul government in South Korea and the population in South Korea, would they resist more strongly opposition to China or a security alignment with Japan? And this gets me to the summit that President Biden joined in Tokyo earlier this month. And that was a summit of the Quad countries. There were 4 countries there that have coalesced. And Andrew, you spoke of encirclement. So there's certainly a perception in China that the Quad is not designed to include China, but to specifically exclude it. Indeed, so is AUKUS and other structures that are being formed. Professor Kim, I want to turn to you for a minute now and get you to respond to this question on the Quad. Where is President Yoon on the Quad? He's talked about associating with the Quad, but not joining it. The US has said South Korea is not likely to join the Quad. What's the preference of the president and his advisors? Do you see South Korea associating with the Quad? Do you see it joining the Quad? What's the debate like?
Okay, but I think it's about Quad. I think it's Biden administration, especially President Biden, losing his interest, and especially because of the behavior of India. India is not really, they don't doing things that not really U.S. wanted to or expected. So, And that's why before, actually in Korea, before Biden's visit, now all the media here has talked about the whether to join Quad or issue, but actually the IPF was the dominating the whole visit. Actually, Quad is not really an important issue, and actually, during the Moon's government, as far as I know, Biden government never asked Korea to join the Quad at all. And before the Biden's visit at this time, and as actually Quad is a four-party system, so it's a clear, actually, Jensaki actually, I believe it talked about that. But somehow, just like that, and actually, President Yoon, during his campaign, he said, we're join the Quad, but after he was elected, that little tone was different. And we started gradually to cooperate gradually, issue by issue. Actually, that position, actually, Moon government already took that. So I don't think this Quad issues for a while become the important issue. And actually, I want to use this opportunity to explain a little bit about the question that Joseph Bosco raised about Japan issue. And as I talked about this before, this will be the big challenge for Yoon. And I know, as I said, they will go forward with improved relationship with Japan, but that will be a trap for Yoon government, because inside Koreans still have a problem. And another issue, 2013-14, actually during the Obama government, we were the one who actually resist, this, and we talked about the historical issues and things, but now Japan is the one who tried to, actually maybe he's teaching a lesson to us, because it's a precondition, three preconditions to improve bilateral relationship between the two countries. One is Korea should accept 1965 renormalization agreement. Second, Korean government should accept comfort woman agreement during the Bakune agreement without change, revision. Three, reverse forced labor issues. That means total surrender. They want total surrender. Okay, Japanese government was very happy that Yoon Suk-yeol won, not just because they're ready to concede. I don't think so. They expect Yoon government to give in. But in that case, if really Yoon did it, then Korean citizens will really resist about that, because they cannot accept that. I think Japan is ready to, and actually they have no plan to concede in any degree, except that export regulation things. Okay, I stop here.
Thank you, Professor Kim. The Japan question certainly remains very potent, but equally potent, if not more. In many ways more, actually, because there is an active conflict that has not been resolved on the border with North Korea. And I want to turn to Jessica now and try and get to a little bit in the time that we have remaining. Try and understand where this is going. We have President Yoon, who's tougher on North Korea. That's well known. North Korea has upped the ante with increased missile tests and so forth, and rhetoric and so forth. So we have a situation that is not as perhaps hopeful in terms of a resolution of the Korean War, a formal end to it and so forth, that may have seemed possible a year or two back on the peninsula. Where do you see, Jessica, the President Yoon's policies on North Korea going, and what is the way out here in a situation of increased tensions?
Thanks, Sarang. Well, before I answer that question, I just want to say this is something I discussed with some of my Korea watching friends here in Washington too, is that, I do think, I mean, a lot of my time is spent analyzing North Korea and thinking about this idea of an endless war on the peninsula. But I will say South Korean kind of politics and South Korea's foreign policy is equally, if not more challenging to understand. There's so many parts to understand and absorb that I don't want this conversation to be kind of now going to North Korea in the remaining time we have and really focus our attention to what we know and what we don't know in Washington about where South Korea is headed, because I think that is something that is not very well understood or explored. But to your question, of course, it seems that, yes, absolutely. The foreign policy challenge for the Yoon administration 3 months in seems to be North Korea because of, like you said, the number of missile tests, including an ICBM test that is, of course, capable of reaching the U.S. mainland. U.S. officials have also warned that North Korea may be continuing to prepare for a 7th nuclear test. And of course, North Korea has conducted more weapons tests this year than in 2020 and 2021 combined. And to your point, during the presidential campaign, candidate Yoon had promised to be tough on North Korea, pledging to kind of teach Kim Jong-un some manners and kind of expecting North Korea to be more pliant and to sort of, see South Korea as a force, not as a country that it can bully. And in the meantime, of course, in Washington, we are pursuing our own sort of engagement and pressure, strategy as well. So all to say, it seems like we're sort of walking in locksteps toward continued arms racing and continued, escalation of rhetorical and other kind of show of force to demonstrate that it is not backing away from, the other side, whether it's U.S., South Korea, or North on the other. And this is entirely unproductive and dangerous, as I said in a recent foreign policy article. Being willing to settle for a smaller deal that involves some sort of a verification of dismantlement of the Yongbyon nuclear complex for easing of certain sanctions seems to be the practical and maybe the only way to slow this kind of train wreck. And so I think all sides have to be more chill, as Andrew rightly put it. We need to just chill out and stop this sort of madness, which I think any observer can plainly see is dangerous, costly, and could have catastrophic consequences if it's not managed well.
And we are going to chill out on this webinar, but not quite yet. I have one more question I'm going to just throw it open to all panelists. This comes from Nat Whitney. And what they want to know is the role of the media in South Korea. There are 3 issues we have talked about today. China, of course, the most, but also Japan and North Korea. All 3 have their divisions within South Korea on how to approach these 3 countries. Where does the media fit into all this in South Korea? Is it a polarized situation like indeed we do have here in the United States? Any of you can answer this, but perhaps I could start with Professor Kim, since he's based in Seoul, and then the other 2 can join in if you want.
Definitely one-sided, but I'm not saying that because I am, opposition side. I'm objectively speaking, there's, one-sided to the conservative media dominating. And actually, for example, 3-4 major progressive media, they didn't have a TV, but all conservative 조선일보 and 중앙, 동아, they all have TV, stations. Not just tells a lot of things, and definitely media are one-sided to conservative.
Jessica, Andrew, do you want to weigh in on this?
Sure. Well, it's there's also progressive media as well too, but in terms of TV and what Dr. Kim didn't mention was internet media is really stoking the flames, and it's a lot of misinformation. So media, yes, media is polarized here or in South Korea as it is in the US. And yes, there's disinformation, a lot of it coming on kind of right-wing type media and also Medium, so Kakao Chat, and there's information that circulates that's not accurate. But that being said, I think the mainstream media, even if they lean conservative or progressive, I'm not sure if you could see that they fan the flames of anti-China sentiment, and specifically because the issue of comfort women issue was addressed. In this case, it was, I think, my perspective, it was domestic politicians that fanned the flames. This would be of now the opposition government. And then it was picked up by media. So I guess media is an enabler, but on the specific issue of the comfort women, I'm not sure if the media was the starting point for causing that ruckus. But I do think that the Korea-Japan issue is often entrapped or beholden to domestic politics, whether it's the media or just public opinion.
Yeah, I mean, we don't have a lot of time, Sarang, but I would just say, there seems to be, I think someone mentioned the word echo chamber earlier, but there's definitely a dominant narrative in Washington and a dominant narrative in South Korea, both of which are very well funded, well connected to each other. And penetrating that, is incredibly difficult. There's no doubt about it. Ask anyone who has tried. And it's very discouraging at times because you feel like you're not being heard or you're being marginalized because your views don't align with the dominant view. So I think this is an area that is definitely worth studying more deeply because it does, I think, have ramification on the space for civil society and outside groups and analysts to properly and accurately analyze what is happening in each other's countries.
Well, that will have to be the last word today. We've tried to cover a lot of topics. We could have easily spoken for another hour, but I want to thank the audience and the panelists for joining us today and discussing this very important issue. And to the audience, do read this brief, download it on the website, read it, and hopefully this will add to our understanding of the situation in the region and the U.S. policy towards the region. I want to end by letting everyone know who's watching that we have more events like these coming up this week. On Wednesday at 7 p.m., we're going to have an excellent discussion on the U.S. economic policy towards Asia. We're going to have some great panelists to talk about it. And then going forward, we'll have more events on Asia and indeed the rest of the world here at the Quincy Institute. So thank you very much for participating.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Good to see you.